maybe we don't have to be in this stance of kind of mutual suspicion and animosity. But someone from the tech world, the science world, can ask a religious person, tell me about your thought world. That can produce a wonderful result. And I think it did in this case. I think it was a really good conversation.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the senior publishing director here at Word on Fire. Bishop Barron has recently had two major discussions with very interesting people, over 1 million views combined. One of them was with Lex Fridman, the professor of robotics and artificial intelligence at MIT, also a very popular podcaster. The second one was with Shia LaBeouf, the Hollywood movie star who has journeyed to the Catholic Church. So what did Bishop Barron think of these two discussions, and what lessons can Catholics take away from them? That's what we'll be talking about today on the podcast. But before we get there, Bishop, I want to welcome you. It's good to see you.
Hey, Brandon, good to see you. And now for the second time from Minnesota, huh? We're a little physically closer than we were in the Santa Barbara days.
Yeah, give us an update on how the new diocese is going. What's been happening there?
Well, a lot. I've been here now for a month as bishop, and the ship is still floating, so that's a good sign, I suppose. I've been just going to a lot of places. So one of my priorities is just to get around to parishes and to see as many people. I think I've been to 9 parishes now, and I've been to one of our high schools. I was at St. Mary's University last week. So that's a high priority, just getting around. Meeting with our consultors, the College of Consultors tomorrow, as well as the Presbyteral Council. I'm just back from Duluth. I was up in Duluth. Never been there before. It's a lovely city, right on the shores of Lake Superior. I was there for the provincial meeting. So all the bishops of Minnesota and the 2 Dakotas get together every summer. So we had 3 days of meetings. And I don't know if we're going to talk about this later, but a highlight for me was the trip to Hibbing, Minnesota, which is the hometown of Bob Dylan, one of my heroes. So on the afternoon of the second day, we all got in a bus. And they kind of indulged me, I think. It was because I wanted to go, but everyone came along. And we went out to Hibbing and saw all the Bob Dylan sites. And it was an interesting thing. So my priority's been just kind of getting around and seeing as many of my people and priests as I can.
You were asking for some prayers because in a couple days you have to take a driver's license test there in Minnesota.
Yeah. I shouldn't say this, but the DMV just makes me nervous, and when you come from out of state, it's true in California too, you come from out of state, you got to do a written driver's exam. Well, they're not easy. I remember the California one was hard, and you do practice tests online. I've been doing them for the past couple of weeks. They're not easy. So say a prayer that I get through the DMV exam on Thursday.
Okay, I wanted to recap these two really interesting discussions you've had, one with Lex Fridman, one with Shia LaBeouf. Let's start with Lex Fridman. So we did this several months ago. I think you and Lex met somewhere in California, just the two of you, filmed this long hour-and-a-half discussion. At the time of this recording, it has 415,000 views, over 4,500 comments on YouTube. Lex has spoken to many cultural influencers, people like Joe Rogan, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Sam Harris, and his audience, I think what most appeals to you, his audience includes millions of young, unaffiliated men and women. This was a tremendous outreach to the nuns. He started off the interview by asking you, what is God? Did you know at that moment that this was going to be a good discussion?
Yeah, I liked him a lot. I'd seen a few of his things, interviews. I met him that day. It was in LA. I remember going from the cathedral over into like the Hollywood area, and we met at a place there. And he just very simply set up a little, couple cameras and some lights, and off we went. It was a 2-hour conversation. He's a very charming guy. Not, confrontative. He's not belligerent. He's just kind of a fellow who seems very curious about everything, eager to learn. And as you say, his area naturally is in the sciences, especially this AI, artificial intelligence field. But, he's interested in everything. And I just found him very engaging fellow to talk to. And that's his style, is to kind of ask really simple, straightforward questions. And so the first one was, who is God? And we took it from there.
You spent a long part of the interview talking about evil and suffering. This seemed to be especially interesting to Lex. How did you think that part of the exchange went?
Yeah, fine. I'm kind of with William Lane Craig on the issue of the problem of suffering. Namely, it has two very different dimensions. The one is emotional, and until the eschaton, it will remain a very emotionally charged issue because all of us suffer. Some of us suffer terribly. And so how do you reconcile that fact with the existence of an all-good God? Now, at the emotional level, that's exceptionally hard to do. And in fact, any attempt to explain it is it's like an affront to our emotional perspective. So there's that side of it. On the other side, again, here I agree with Craig, there's a kind of purely intellectual side of that question. And there, the argument, in my mind, is a very weak one. Because to use our suffering as a proof that there is no God rests upon an impossible premise. Namely, that we, with our absolutely limited intelligences, can somehow grasp that there's no justification possible for God's allowing certain evils and certain suffering. Well, just ipso facto, we can't do that. We are in zero position ever to do that. Therefore, from a purely logical standpoint, it's quite a weak argument. And to be honest about it, Brandon, we, by which I mean here the great tradition and its opponents, have rehearsed this argument over and over and over again for centuries. And I don't think we've made a lot of progress coming up with some clever new way to respond. I think the classical responses are valid from an intellectual standpoint, though they will never satisfy our emotional frustration over this issue, if that makes any sense. So that's why whenever it comes up, I'm happy to engage the argument and happy to show, here's, I think, the way we should think about it. But in a way, it's like hopeless. I mean, read the comments. Whenever you bring this issue up, someone will say, well, that's completely persuasive. And, well, I mean, how can you possibly say that, the cancer of a young kid? Yeah, I get it. I totally get it from an emotional standpoint. But intellectually, it's not a very persuasive counter-argument. So I guess what I'm saying is that, in a way, it's a little tiresome to me, constantly revisiting this issue of suffering, because I'm not sure there's that much more we can say about it.
I mentioned that the interview garnered lots of comments, over 4,500 comments when I just looked at it, and there's lots of positive ones, lots of people who were surprised. Oh yeah,
the vast majority are very positive.
Yeah, that was my take as well, but I wanted to talk about some of the negative trends. You did an article commenting on this, and I wanted to ask you more about it. Without a doubt, the most common grouping of the negative comments was that you were just tossing out word salad. They would say things like it was gobbledygook, or you were using a lot of big words to say nothing at all. What do you make of those types of criticisms?
Yeah, and a lot of that focused on the very first question he asked me, which is, who is God? And I decided to give him a fairly elevated answer, a sophisticated answer that comes out of our metaphysical tradition. And as people who have followed me for years would know, I rely very much on Thomas Aquinas, that God is not a being among many. We really shouldn't call him a supreme being. He's not an item within the universe or alongside the universe, but rather God is ipsum esse, the sheer act of to be itself, in and through which all finite things, all contingent things exist. And I just sort of elaborated that idea. Now, here's what struck me, Brandon, when I read the comments is, gosh, there's an arrogance behind that. If a high theoretical physicist from, Cambridge came on and started talking in the technical language of his discipline at a very high level, and I were to say, oh, it's a bunch of word salad, what a bunch of gobbledygook, and that guy is just, you accuse me of the worst kind of stupidity and arrogance, right? Why not say, boy, that guy is using language that I don't really understand, or I don't know what the frame of reference is, and boy, I got a lot to learn about theoretical physics, and maybe I should take it, a step at a time and start at a lower level, or, I'm saying? That would be a far more reasonable perspective. But to simply jump to the conclusion that, I'm just trading in word salad, when in fact, what I was trading in was a manner of speaking that was typical of the very smartest people in the West up until the modern period. So I'm relying on a tradition as old as Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Boethius, Augustine, Aquinas, Anselm, Bonaventure, etc. And I was speaking out of that tradition in a kind of technically precise way. Okay, I think a better response would have been, I'm not quite sure what he's talking about, but maybe I could brush up on that. Maybe I could look into that a little bit. Maybe I could start at a somewhat lower level and see, what he's talking about. It was a sign to me, Brandon, of the scientism which bedevils a lot of people today. That's to say, the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. That people in our schools just have no acquaintance with classical philosophical speech. And so it just strikes them as a bunch of nonsense. So I guess I was struck by that and would call upon a lot of my critics there maybe to demonstrate just a touch more humility and maybe try to learn a little bit of that tradition that I was talking out of.
I think the second most common type of criticism you got for this Lex Fridman interview was that the very fact that you were Catholic disqualified you in all ways. And this, to me, was very resonant with the types of comments you got when you did the Reddit AMA. There was a lot of these types of things. So let me read you off a few examples. One, how can you listen to a representative of the most corrupt institution in history? Two, religion, especially the Catholic religion, is responsible for the death of millions. And perhaps the best one of all, number three, of all the differing variations of Christianity, Catholicism is by far the most cynical, repugnant, crass variant. It's done more harm to the human species than any other religion, and it's kept us back from progressing. What say you?
He's really fond of Catholicism, huh? Here's the first thing I'd say, Brandon, and I want to be blunt about this. How anybody after the 20th century could say that the institution that's done the most damage to the human race is the Catholic Church after Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Hitler? Are you joking? Are you serious? That you can have witnessed all of that. So these radically secularist ideologies that produced mountains of corpses, tens of millions of corpses in the 20th century. You can witness all that and still say the Catholic Church is the source of greatest corruption, has done the most damage. I mean, give me a break. So that's my first reaction. Second reaction, have Catholics in the course of 2,000 years done lots and lots and lots of bad things? Yes, of course they have. Of course they have. But it's like shooting fish in a barrel to say, hey, I can find instances of corruption and bad behavior on the part of Catholics. Well, yeah. Our very doctrine of original sin, and that original sin carries with it this kind of overtone of concupiscence, meaning a sort of perverse twisting of the will and so on, leads us to expect human corruption. So, I mean, that's not repugnant to Catholicism. We expect that people, very much including Catholics, are going to behave badly. But look, have lots and lots and lots of Americans behaved badly? Well, yeah. I mean, over 200 and some years, I can point to myriad examples of Americans, often in the name of American values, behaving very badly indeed. Does that mean American values are bad? Does that mean American institutions are all corrupt? That speaking from an American perspective is ipso facto bad? I should never listen to anyone that advocates the American political experiment. Well, of course not. Of course not. Those values remain intact, even as lots and lots and lots of Americans have not lived up to them. So in a similar way, sure, Catholic values, Catholic principles, Catholic ideals remain intact, even as lots and lots and lots of Catholics don't live up to them. And so when I'm speaking to Lex Fridman out of the Catholic intellectual and cultural tradition, I'm not saying, hey, Lex, every single Catholic who's ever lived has just been a great person and a saint. Well, of course not. Of course not. I'm saying the great animating principles and convictions and values of Catholicism are worthwhile. And so that, to me, it's a red herring, that argument, he's saying persuasive things about God. Oh, well, remember how bad Catholics have been over the centuries. Well, yeah, I know, but I'm not going to be distracted by that observation. It's a cheap rhetorical trick.
Well, I want to ask you this question, which I'll also ask you about your Shia LaBeouf interview. But with Lex Fridman, as a Catholic evangelist, what's the biggest takeaway you had from this exchange? What lesson did you learn?
That's a good question. You know, I say, Brandon, honestly, I don't look at me, look at Lex Fridman. I would say and again, I don't really know anything about Lex Fridman's views on religion. I really have no idea. But let's say for sake of argument, he's someone coming out of like the more scientific world, that when someone in a world that's other than the religious world is willing to listen with respect and with curious intelligence, then great things can happen. A great conversation can unfold. Maybe we don't have to be in this stance of kind of mutual suspicion and animosity, but someone from the tech world, the science world, can ask a religious person, tell me about your thought world. That can produce a wonderful result. And I think it did in this case. I think it was a really good conversation. So I guess what I learned, I would say kudos to Lex Fridman. I think he demonstrated a very positive attitude when entering into these conversations, where like the new atheists sadly taught a whole generation of young people the right way to engage religious people is to refer to them as stupid and to denigrate their point of view and to mock them publicly. Well, again, kudos to Lex Fridman, who did none of those things and was willing to listen. And I think a lot of people benefited from that. So that's what I take away from it.
Well, let's turn now to talking about your exchange with Shia LaBeouf. This one has taken off in extraordinary ways. At the time of this recording, it's just about at 1 million views, 5,000 comments on YouTube. You sat down to do this interview, I believe, just a couple weeks before your transition.
A couple days even, I think.
A couple days before you went to Minnesota. At that time, did you have any idea how explosively popular that discussion would become?
Well, I would say that I did say to people, I think it'll get 1 million views. But I didn't think it would get 1 million views in 4 days or whatever it is. And I must say, I didn't expect, to be picked up by news agencies all over the world, which indeed it was. So no, I didn't see that coming. I knew it would be popular because he's, a very popular actor, especially with young people who tend to be online. So I knew it would have an impact. And that's why I wanted to do it, because I had heard a version of his story a little bit earlier. And I thought, boy, it'd be great if especially young people could hear that story. So I just asked him, I said, would you be willing to sit down, for a more formal interview? And he said, yeah, I would. So no, I knew it would have an impact, not quite the impact that it's had.
Many people, especially online, celebrated this interview as an example of what the church fundamentally exists for. Namely, the church is for sinners. The church is for broken people. It's not a clubhouse for the pious. Shia, by his own admission, is a broken man. He's been accused of a lot of horrible things. He described himself as depraved or having committed depraved acts. But when we talk about saving souls, leading people to salvation, we're not talking about abstractions, immaterial souls. We're talking about real hurt and brokenness in people's lives. Talk about that reaction. Were you happy to see that people were celebrating this as a great news, as good news? Yeah, and the overwhelming majority of people that commented, I think, saw exactly that. Yeah, I thought, Brandon, a lot of Pope Francis' line about the church as a field hospital. Where people, because I've made this point, a field hospital, that's not just a regular hospital that you might go to for some tests, right? A field hospital is one that's near a field of battle. It's a place where people are gravely wounded, and by the culture and by all sorts of things. And I think Shia, by his own admission, was someone who's been kind of gravely wounded and was in very bad spiritual shape. In fact, he talked frankly about suicide. I had a gun on the table, that he had hit bottom. Well, that's where the church belongs. The church belongs there. And it's a field hospital to help people who are deeply wounded. And I think what's beautiful in his story is it functioned just that way. Because he, starts his process of preparing to play Padre Pio, but at that point he wasn't particularly interested in what religion would do for him. It's what he found
especially among those wonderful Capuchin friars whom I knew very well out in California. See, to me, that's the central story that he was telling in the interview, was about the Capuchin friars who, very much in the spirit of the Lord Jesus and of St. Francis, took in this young guy who was more than a little bit lost. They had nothing to gain from him, and they weren't playing any kind of. In fact, I bet most of them didn't know who he was, but they took in this young suffering soul, and they acted as doctors and nurses in a field hospital, I think, for him, and brought him back to a very profound spiritual healing. So to me, that's a beautiful story, and I thought that's why I wanted him to tell it.
You know those Capuchin friars very well because they're in your former Santa Barbara pastoral region. You knew each of the people he was mentioning.
Yeah.
What do you think they did right in terms of evangelization?
They reached out to him in love, and they weren't judging him, and they weren't trying to indoctrinate him. They reached out in love. They included him in their life. He talked, I love this, about laughter. Long before they got to talking about St. Francis, and he got there. He wanted to find out about Francis and who was this Padre Pio and tell me about their spirituality. And they got there with him. They did. But he said in the beginning, he laughed a lot with them. And they were human with him. They were welcoming and inclusive. Use all the wonderful language that our present Pope uses. They were inclusive of him and brought him into their manner of life, and that functioned as a field hospital. It healed him. And then when it was time, he began to ask questions. And then they were happy to give answers. They did. They talked a lot about Francis and a lot about Padre Pio. I know him very well. The Father James he talks about is a older Capuchin, big guy, kind of a big bear of a guy. And Shia said, he just put his hand on his shoulder, and he would just, say a couple encouraging things to him and then, move on. And just kind of a simple expression of his solidarity with him, but meant the world to him. But then eventually Father James talked to him about Padre Pio and how he should play him and all that. So they were, I thought, brilliant evangelizers. They didn't make the mistake of judging him. And may I just say, Brandon, to my fellow Catholics, it's a major problem in our faith community is we love to judge people. We love to judge people. And that move maybe makes you feel good at some perverse level, but it ain't effective evangelically, trust me. Second danger is we can start sort of proselytizing right away. Let's get right into, having arguments and debates. Look, I love arguments and debates. That's my whole life is based on that. And we get there. We should get there. But often the opening move is that hand on a shoulder, or it's laughing, or it's, I know you're living in a van down by the river. I mean, you're living in a van out in our parking lot, but that's okay. Those are marvelous opening moves. Call them pre-evangelization.
One of the patterns in Shia's story is this transition from the ego drama to the theodrama, to use your language and Balthazar's language. In fact, I believe at one point Shia even says something like, he referring to God, used my ego for his purposes. Yeah. Talk about that shift. Shia says, for a long time, it was all about him. He wanted to be a great actor. That was his purpose in life. But then that was finally drawn up to God's plan for his life, and that opened things up.
God uses whatever he can to accomplish his purposes. And it might be he leads us to a dead end. So he allows us to go to the pit or to the dead end of our egotism, and then we collapse. Or maybe I think in his case, it was like he wanted to get back on track. He wanted to be a famous actor again. And hey, here's a chance. Here's this juicy role of playing this Padre Pio. I'm going to do that. And so I think he saw God luring him by that sort of egotistic thing, but it brought him into the trap, as it were. It brought him into the place where, wow, now this whole world's open up to me. And so, sure. I think I used the line, didn't I, Brandon, in the interview? I forget now, but the famous Chesterton line from the Father Brown story about God will allow us to wander to the ends of the world, but then by a twitch upon the thread can bring us back, And I think that's something of the Shia LaBeouf story, that he wandered, quite a ways away, but God found a way to bring him back. And From the providential perspective, someone like him, the power that can have, if God finds a way to bring him back, that can bring many, many others back. And, please God, our video, having gone out now to 1 million people, that's what I hoped for it, that it would be a twitch upon the thread for a lot of people.
All right, let's close with this question, which I just asked you about Lex Fridman. I'll ask you about your exchange with Shia LaBeouf. As a Catholic evangelist, what's the big takeaway? What's the big lesson learned from this discussion and how it's been received?
Yeah, it's a good question, Brandon, and it's just worth really thinking about more deeply. I think for me the takeaway are the Capuchins, how they evangelize this young guy. That evangelization, and here I'm in the Newman spirit again, is not just intellectualism, it's not just arguments, it's not just clarifying ideas, but very often it's the drawing people into the beauty of a form of life and to let them see, hey, how these Christians love one another. Look at how these Christians live. They were a hand reached out to him when he was drowning. And he used that image I thought was really good. What Christianity says, if you're drowning, is not, hey, here's a program for how to swim. It says, reach out and trust. There's a hand that wants to draw you out of these waters, and trust him. Well, see, the hand of Christ is seen in the hands of his mystical body. It was those Capuchins in California that reached out literally to him, and they were the hands of Christ, who drew him out of the waters and into a safer place. And there he was able to grow in his faith. I think that's the evangelical lesson.
Well, it's time now for our listener question. Every episode, we take a question from one of our listeners. If you have one that you'd like to ask Bishop Barron, send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today, we hear from Patty in your home state of Illinois. She's asking about how you're able to juggle all the things that you do. Here's her question.
My name is Patty, and I'm from Illinois, and I'd like to know how you get so many things done. You have so many jobs you juggle, and I struggle with time management. Do you have any tips for that? Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. People ask me that all the time, and I don't know if I have really a good, clear answer. I guess prioritization, that when I wake up in the morning, I will tend to prioritize. Here's what I really have to do today. I think from an administrative standpoint, you get overwhelmed with all the different things. So now that I'm the ordinary of this diocese, dozens of things are thrown at you all the time. But what's your pastoral priority? What's the one thing you really want to accomplish? And can you make the other things serve that one thing? I do set aside certain days and times if I can. It can't always work that way, but I might say, Thursday this week is going to be a Word on Fire preparation day. I'm going to write articles. I'm going to write part of a book or something like that. Friday, that's a day for my meetings. Sunday, that's the day I'm going to be out and about, going to parishes. Monday is going to be a day off. To kind of respect the integrity of a given day, that I'm going to do a certain amount of focused work that day. That helps me a bit. But I often think I could be a lot more productive. I feel like but maybe I should say that. That's not a bad thing. At the end of the day, I like to watch TV, like the end of the day. I never watch during the day. I think that to me is always a sign of something's wrong. But the end of the day, and I can catch my brain saying, "Oh, why aren't you doing some more serious reading right now? You need to get ready for." I'll say, "Oh, calm down. This is good for me. I'm just going to watch some stupid movie or a stupid TV show or something, or a baseball game." So that's important too to get. And I also exercise every day. I make sure I get the physical, because a lot of my life is lived up from the neck up. It's ideas and talking, and it's books, and So make sure I remind myself that I have a body. I think is a good thing too. So those are a couple kind of disconnected thoughts.
Well, as we wrap up our episode today, I want to announce an exciting new book from Word on Fire that launches today, actually. It's titled With All Her Mind, A Call to the Intellectual Life. It's edited by Rachel Bullman. The feminine genius is a term coined by Pope St. John Paul II. It's become somewhat of a buzzword in the Catholic world, but has the fullness of femininity been exhausted? This book includes a collection of 17 essays written by Catholic women of diverse backgrounds and vocations. It's a call to pursue what is too often excluded from our picture of femininity, namely the intellectual life. With All Her Mind shows how the feminine genius involves both affectivity and active intellectual engagement. Features some fantastic essays, a foreword by Tracy Rowland, who is the winner of the Ratzinger Prize for Theology. This book will open up all women to follow the first and greatest commandment, to love the Lord with all her soul, with all her heart, and with all her mind. So again, it's called With All Her Mind, A Call to the Intellectual Life. I'll include a link to that new book in the show notes for this episode. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
Thank you.